Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. And thank you especially to the people who make this possible for you with their support at patreon.com/SW7x7. All right, so this is it's going to be one of our deep dive episodes related to episode 6 of the Acolyte, Teach Corrupt. And for this episode, we're going to focus on the idea of force powers and whether they fade, whether they don't fade. This is not a new concept introduced to us in this episode of the Acolyte, but let's talk about what the deal is, because as we noted in the previous episode, in our 7 takeaway breakdown episode, Qimir, for all intents and purposes, he may be telling the truth, from a certain point of view, but as a Sith, just generally speaking, he can't necessarily be fully trusted, and we have to take what he's saying with a grain of salt. So we'll start by flagging the fact that Ohsa says that, according to the Jedi, that if you stop being a Jedi, that your force powers will fade away. And Qimir doesn't exactly say that's not the case. What he suggests to her is that there are ways to bring force powers back by tapping into different emotions that the Jedi Order does not approve of being tapped into. Both of these statements are essentially half true. Not that Ohsa is giving us a half truth by saying that force powers will fade, but by having been taught by the Jedi Order this half truth that force powers will fade. On the one hand, it is probably accurate in the sense that without training from in early childhood, basically, then it's certainly a lot more difficult to access one's force powers in that magical, mystical way that elevates a person to being able to be in the Jedi Order, for example, with like that level of capability, right? I mean, we heard that from Ahsoka in The Mandalorian when she talked about letting Grogu's powers fade, and Grogu is, for all intents and purposes, a toddler at that point. So without training, his force powers would probably fade. Similar kind of idea, Anakin Skywalker, 9 years old at the time we meet him in The Phantom Menace, has not had any training with his force powers whatsoever. Certainly very strong in the force, as we find out, but the only way it's really manifesting is that he has quicker reflexes than humans his age or adult humans. And that's true of us as human beings too, right? The idea that if we are not practicing certain skills, then we will lose our ability to perform them, and we may be able to pick them up again. We may be able to, tap in at some level, but as we age, it will not necessarily be as strong as it was in our younger years. You can think about that like Olympic athletes who are in peak physical and mental condition in the primes of their lives. And for every Olympic athlete out there, there are probably 10 other people who might have been able to, with the same resources, perform as well or almost as well as any of those Olympic athletes. Then you have Qimir on the other side of things, and he says, nope, the Jedi are lying, like force powers don't fade. You can tap into them by tapping into deeper emotions like anger and fear and loss and desire. Now, he is right that you can tap into the Force using those feelings, but of course, those are dark side emotions, but they are not necessarily required to be able to re-tap into the Force. He is identifying the fact that the Jedi have lied to Ohsa about this particular aspect of things. But even Ohsa herself noted in the Night episode that as she was interacting with the Jedi again, her senses were starting to come back to her. And she definitely was thinking more of herself in the Jedi way of things during those episodes. So clearly she's able to reconnect with the Force in a light side kind of fashion, even though she's been comparatively dormant for some time, or at least thinks she has. But ultimately, what we have learned about the Force is that the Force is available to anyone who wants to tap into it and practice it. There's a bit in the Kylo Ren comic miniseries where Luke Skywalker is talking about Ben Solo at the time and talking about Ben compared to another one of his pupils training on Ohsa. And Luke's take on things is that anybody can open the door to the Force. And yeah, maybe some people might be born on second base comparatively speaking, but pretty much anybody can open that door. And we do see that as well with Sabine Wren in the Ahsoka series, who it was suggested might have had some ability to connect to the Force back in Star Wars Rebels, but she was finally able to break through the barrier that had been in place in her mind, basically, in the Ahsoka series, and was able to tap into the Force in a way that we can visually and viscerally see and recognize. So what the conversation comes down to in this episode of The Acolyte is that it really is, as Mother Anastasia says, about power and who is allowed to use it. If you're a member of the Jedi Order, then you are approved to use that power because of the way that the Jedi Order is sort of intertwined with the Republic, the High Republic in the time. And if you wash out of the Jedi Order, then you're supposed to not be able to use the Force. And, you know, whether they tell you that, oh, that's just going to happen because you're not in the Jedi Order, or whether it's just because you leave the Jedi Order and you stop doing the things that might have allowed you to connect more readily with the Force and be able to put it to your particular use, you know, or you accept a job within the Jedi Order that isn't actively being a Jedi, and because you're not practicing those skills and they just fade over time like any other skills might, right? Like, that's ultimately what we're talking about here. The Jedi are creating this narrative that if you're not part of the Jedi Order, then you're not practicing with the Force in any particular way, and they're creating a situation that causes people to lose their Force powers for all intents and purposes, and thus ensuring that they are the only people who are wielding and manipulating the Force in the galaxy. And then on the other side, you have Qimir, who says he just wants the freedom to be able to use the power that he has in the way that he wants to use it. And on the one hand, sure, yeah, the Jedi shouldn't be telling him what he can and can't do. On the other hand, if he is using it for evil and criminal means, then somebody's got to step in, and it's got to be people who also can use the Force. And I guess Qimir would be more sympathetic if he had just been like, hey, I'm a Sith and I just want to use the powers and be happy and have fun and do parlor tricks and all that stuff. But it's kind of another thing when he is recruiting a pupil who he then says, in order to please me, you're going to have to kill a bunch of Jedi, right? So that's what I've got for you on our deep dive about Force powers and whether they fade or not, how they can be reactivated, and who's allowed to use that power. That's what I've got for you for this episode of the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please help me get it out to more people who might enjoy this dose of Star Wars joy. You can do that with algorithms. You can do that by just telling people yourself. And you can also help me as an independent creator produce this show. And you can learn more about that at patreon.com/SW7X7. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, as always. And may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyrighted by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.